Hi, this is Beth Wadham from the Association for Contemplative Mind in Higher Education, and welcome to our March webinar, The Contemplative Spirituality of Toni Morrison, with Linda Susan Beard. So we're going to begin in just a couple minutes. So we're delighted to be here today with Linda Susan Beard. A professor of English at Bryn, Mawr, Linda Susan teaches African American, South African, post-colonial, and post-apartheid literature. Her courses, which have been called suffering courses, invite students to experience these stories from a deeply contemplative and compassionate perspective. Linda Susan was one of the Center's first contemplative practice fellows back in 1997, and we have appreciated her long friendship with this organization. She frequently teaches at our summer session, our summer contemplative curriculum session, and she appears regularly at meetings and conferences on contemplative education. One other thing before I hand over this presentation to Linda Susan, I do want to let you know that she's planned for us to navigate for a short time away from this webinar on a kind of field trip to visit together a clip on YouTube. And now I'd like to welcome Linda Susan, looking forward eagerly to the presentation. Thanks so much for joining us, and I'll hand the presentation over to you now.
Good afternoon, good morning, whatever time zone you are in. Welcome. I'm so glad to be able to spend some time with you this afternoon thinking about Toni Morrison's contemplative spirituality. I wanted us to begin as a community with a shared experience. And so you're going to be clicking onto a visual and an audio meditation on two words. Those words are strange fruit and a representation of one part of the violent, unspeakable, and unspoken history of African Americans and their trauma. Some of the graphic images come from a book that Toni Morrison edited in 1974 called The Black Book. The volume includes elements from the whole range of human experiences, however, but we're going to be looking at some that are particularly difficult. If graphic images are hard for you, then I recommend that you close your eyes and listen to Nina Simone sing to you.
So we can go now, Linda Susan,
Yes.
to the clip?
Yes.
All right, and then we'll return in about 3 minutes.
I thought I would just give us a moment to collect ourselves after such an experience. In the face of such experience, it's sometimes necessary to be still, or to listen, or to hold what singes our touch and scorches the soul. It is a matter of just being and bearing witness, of sitting with trauma. One wants to find a way to acknowledge the past, to companion the ghosts, but in a way that does not destroy one from such close proximity to a consuming fire. The Events by the Road Project is a brilliant idea of the Toni Morrison Society. It's a way of giving pause, but of bearing witness to all those who have not been remembered or recorded. And we'll be looking at some places where such benches have been installed as we go along. But we'll start together in this place. In Beloved, Sefa admits that we sometimes disremember, that we consciously force out of consciousness that which is overwhelmingly painful. But the past exists in the present. History is not far from us. It's always tangible. And the past cannot be expunged or erased. In fact, it's always possible that one might bump up against another's memory. In one of the novels we learn, if you go there, you who was never there, if you go there and stand in the place where it was, it will happen again. And it will be there waiting for you. Even though it's all over and done with, it's going to always be there waiting for you. That's how Sethe describes for Denver in the novel Beloved her own theory of history. And this is essential, painful, but I believe ultimately liberating work. And one way of forging a way through, I think, is with the use of a contemplative way of seeing and of knowing. In a 1989 interview in Time magazine, Morrison explains why she writes about slaves. She says, quote, "I was trying to make it a personal experience. The book was not about the institution, slavery with a capital S. It was about these anonymous people called slaves. What they do to keep on, how they make a life, what they're willing to risk, however long it lasts, in order to relate to one another. That was incredible to me." And it seems to me that at least 4 of the things that characterize the contemplative lens, the contemplative way of seeing, is acknowledging our interconnection, and the interconnection of all time, of all experience, as well as our interdependence. It involves as well acknowledging mystery. And then the most interesting part of all, I think, moving beyond judgment and a sense of mastery. And I think there are particular ways that Morrison does this in her fiction and in some of her essays. And I think it's all a testament to her commitment to a contemplative way of seeing, a contemplative way of knowing. I think another part of that contemplative perspective is moving away from the tyranny of a false self. Morrison says a dead language is not only one no longer spoken or written. It is unyielding language, content to admire its own paralysis. Like statist language, censored and censoring, ruthless in its policing duties. It has no desire or purpose other than maintaining the free range of its own narcotic narcissism, its own exclusivity and dominance. Morrison goes on to say that such paralysis is not without effect because it, quote, actively thwarts the intellect, stalls conscience, suppresses human potential. It's unreceptive to interrogation. It cannot form or tolerate new ideas, shape other thoughts, tell another story, or fill baffling silences, end quote. We tell a story, then, as a way of bypassing the dangerous illusion of amnesia and hopefully exorcising the past. Again, in one of her novels, the text tells us freeing yourself was one thing. Claiming ownership of that freed self was another. In Beloved, Baby Suggs leads a powerful service of sort of laying on of hands in the clearing. She asks all of the former slaves to wrap their arms around their shoulders, to embrace their legs, to embrace their arms, because these are the very parts of themselves the master did not love. And so I thought these wonderful images of dancers gives us a sense when we look at Judith Jamison or the dancers from the Alvin Ailey Dance Company that we are not merely pieces of sculpture. The abuse of the black body can be contested, and there is a freedom that is more than the apparent defiance of gravity. When given one of her many, many, many awards, this one by the National Book Foundation in 1996, Morrison has a very short acceptance speech called The Dancing Mind. She opens her thanks with these words: "There is a certain kind of peace that is not merely the absence of war. It's larger than that. The peace I am thinking of is not at the mercy of history's rule, nor is it a passive surrender to the status quo." And she continues, "The peace I am thinking of is the dance of an open mind when it engages another equally open one, an activity that occurs most naturally, most often in the reading, writing world we live in." One of the ways in which I think one can begin to approach the difficult work of holding both suffering and the move towards liberation is the use of a meditation technique, a contemplative practice that's about 1,500 years old, certainly a cornerstone of the Benedictine tradition, called Lectio, which simply means reading. But it's reading in a different mode. It's reading that deliberately slows down the pace. One's not reading for information or comprehension. One's not going to do anything with this reading except perhaps to be still with a word or a phrase, and very often not one that you select, but that one that claims you. You might be reading a short paragraph and find you have to stop because there's a word that grabs you and speaks to you in the concrete details of your own life at the moment. And that slow, attentive reading may lead to reflection. One can imagine perhaps reflecting simply on some of the visuals from the strange fruit video, or reflecting simply on those words, strange fruit. That in turn might lead to an oral response. Certainly in a monastic tradition, one would be talking about a verbal prayer. And all of this with the hope that one will rest in the quiet in order to open oneself up to a very deep hearing. There's a course I get to teach at Bryn Mawr every year. It's called Toni Morrison and the Art of Narrative Conjure. I love the sexiness of that title. And students have the extraordinary opportunity of reading almost everything that Morrison has written, at least in terms of her creative works and some of her essays. Most people don't know that she was born in 1931 as Chloe Anthony Wofford and has been Toni Morrison ever since. And over the course of 4 decades, she's had a great deal to say. And one of the things that students realize after you've read one text after another in publication order is that you get to have a sense of what's the Morrison signature, what characterizes her. It's also fun sometimes when people say, this book doesn't seem to be working with the Morrison signature, even though she's written it. She's again doing what she does all through. She's teaching us a number of things. And one of the things that Morrison is best at teaching is coming to recognize our assumptions and trying to let them go. I have a list here for you of some of those major works and the publication dates. Those of you who want to go back to the website will be able to get download a copy for yourself of all of these texts. But I wanted to start at the very top with a text many people don't know about. It's a short story in which one can sort of see Morrison beginning her work of trying to separate us from our expectations and our assumptions, and in large part because these are the things that very often lead to judgment. And our judgments are usually very fallible. We have 2 little girls in this short story, and we're told one is white and one is black, but we're never told which one is which. And so as you read along, you become conscious of the ways in which you're trying to capture clues to figure out, is this the black child? Is this the white child? And all along you are putting together sociological information. You're putting together information about the home situation. And then you realize just how much you rely on those assumptions. Morrison plays again with this in her novel Paradise. Certainly the opening line of that novel tells you that they shoot the white girl first. They can afford to take their time with the rest of them. And lots of readers have talked about how much they've gone through the text trying to figure out what the clues are as to which is the white girl. Again, laying that down is not the work of a moment, but it's part of a discipline of recognizing that one needs to let one's assumptions rest. They invariably get one into trouble. Yet another part of that contemplative worldview, a reverence for language as mystery, certainly the mystery component, but also part of the Morrison signature. She says, language can never pin down slavery, genocide, or war, nor should it yearn for the arrogance to be able to do so. Its force, its felicity, is in its reach towards the ineffable, the unnameable. Early in her novel, The Bluest Eye, Morrison suggests that sometimes we want to rush into a situation and ask the question, why? But there's a certain arrogance in asking such a question because sometimes the question can't be answered. After looking at the Strange Fruit video, where does one go with the question, why? Sometimes, she says, we have to be content with all the time it takes to understand the who, the what, the where, and the when. Now here's an example of Morrison sort of capturing us and making us slow down. In that novel, The Bluest Eye, we encounter this extraordinary sentence: nuns go by as quiet as lust, and drunken men and sober eyes sing in the lobby of the Greek hotel. Well, in a novel that talks about love and self-hatred, that talks about incest and violence against a child, what do we do with the relationship between nuns and lust? What do we do with sober eyes that sing? That's the kind of thing I think one can take and simply use Lectio for. One can sit and ask, what word in that jumps out at me and claims me as I am reading this book? Nuns go by as quiet as lust. Is Morrison deliberately putting things into juxtaposition to get our attention? What is she doing? She says that the ability of writers to imagine what is not the self, to familiarize the strange and mystify the familiar, is the test, in essence, of the writer's power. And one can understand that if you think about fiction in which one character has no navel, where a best friend, a moment after dying, can't wait to tell her closest companion that dying is really not all that hard, or where there appears an unusual woman who may in fact be the ghost of a murdered child, a child killed because her mother believes firmly that death is preferable to slavery, especially for a woman. Yet another part of that Morrison signature, honoring the unsung and the invisible ones. Morrison herself says there is no suitable memorial or plaque or wreath or wall or park or skyscraper lobby. There's no 300-foot tower. There's no small bench by the road where we can sit and remember the history of African Americans, their triumphs as well as their struggles. And so that is what gives us the Bench by the Road project. Here's an example of 200 people with Morrison in the lead, if you look to the left, going to put up a bench on Sullivan's Island, one of the gateways of slavery. At the top of the page, students and members of the town from Oberlin, Ohio, doing the landscaping for putting a bench by the road, in essence in Morrison's backyard, the place she grew up in many ways. Or at the bottom of the page, a wonderful parade in Paris celebrating the bench by the road that did go up in that city. So much of Morrison's fiction seems to me to be about moving beyond the familiar, recognizing the power of change, not simply looking at the past as if it were static, but recognizing that we are changing in relationship to the way in which we hold that past. The most simple things, another example of a text one might want to just sit with. She talks about color. You think dark is just one color, but it ain't. There are 5 or 6 kinds of black. Some silky, some woolly, some just empty. Some like fingers and it don't stay still. It moves and changes from one kind of black to another. Saying something is pitch black is like saying something is green. What kind of green? Well, night black is the same way. May as well be a rainbow. Dark is just one color? No. There's 5 or 6 kinds of black. May as well be a rainbow. Morrison's works examine very deeply questions about the thickness or thinness of love. In this novel, a man recognizing that his son would always be a stranger to him builds a greenhouse as a place of controlled, ever-flowering life to greet death in. Certainly, Sepha's decision to kill her child is talked of in terms of whether or not love can be too thick. And one of the questions there is, can a slave afford to love when the one you love may very well be taken away from you? Here's part of text from Beloved that touches on that. Risky, thought Paul D., very risky. For a used-to-be slave woman to love anything that much was dangerous, especially if it was her children she had settled on to love. The best thing he knew was to love just a little bit. So when they broke its back or shoved it in a croaker sack, well, maybe you'd have a little love left over for the next one. And this is a picture of a former slave whose name we do know, Mrs. Fanny Parrott, and a photograph taken in 1941. Or in Morrison's novel, Jazz, she's not just talking about language, but also talking about sound. Here we have Billie Holiday representing the Harlem Renaissance and the Jazz Age, and certainly the very bittersweetness with which we tell the story of the African American presence in the U.S. Jazz takes us from the fields and into the urban centers, into the cities, to try to give us, the novel Jazz, to try to give us a sense of what it was like for African Americans leaving the South and its oppressive violence to face a whole new set of challenges in New York, Kansas, Michigan, Ohio, and Oklahoma. Nina Simone has a fabulous definition of jazz, which you might think of in terms of that novel and in terms of music itself. She says, jazz is not music. It's a way of life, it's a way of being, it's a way of thinking. I think that the Negro in America is jazz. Everything he does, the slang he uses, the way he talks, his jargon, the new inventive phrases we make up to describe things, all that to me is jazz, just as much as the music we play. Jazz is not just music. It's the definition of the African American black. And here in this very rare photograph, we see Billie Holiday standing in the New York Metropolitan Opera House, January 1944. From that novel, and I would direct you to the very last paragraph of it, we learn that there's a relationship between the teller of the tale and the reader, one that's very important to Morrison, and one that's very much about mutuality. It's a description of the lovemaking that takes place between the book and the one whose hands embrace the book. The very end of this citation, I love the way you hold me, how close you let me be to you. I like your fingers on and on, lifting, turning. I have watched your face for a long time now and missed your eyes when you went away from me. Talking to you and hearing your answer, that's the kick. But this is also a description of what Morrison thinks she is doing as writer. She doesn't fill in all the gaps. She leaves empty spaces. If you're the sort of person who has to have a cause and effect relationship explained, Morrison will frustrate you. And part of that is, she says, we are writing the book together, and your act of interpretation, which changes every time you read the text, is part of our co-creation, part of our working together. It's part of a sort of contemplative give and take. We're going to write together a history but we're not simply going to scowl. Morrison also laughs, because part of what she's telling us about two little girls, for example, in Sula, because each had discovered years before that they were neither white nor male, and that all freedom and triumph was forbidden to them, they had set out creating something else to be. And the creating something else to be is not just those little girls. We have here, as we near the end of the slides, this extraordinary commissioned work, a representation in order to commemorate the African burial grounds in Midtown, New York. A way of saying those 15,000 to 20,000 bodies whose bones lay underneath the skyscrapers of New York are part of the foundation of the place. A very quick last comment. This wonderful course that I am privileged to teach, Toni Morrison, The Art of Narrative Conjure, deliberately makes use of contemplative practices. Students have to do a rememory project. They have to come to terms with a place that's haunted. They have to go and bump into rememory. They have a pilot project. Some students do choreography, some paint, some throw pots. For the most part, students do things they've never done before. And the English department is privileged to have a fabulous quilt given us by students who met a whole semester and took a scene from each of Morrison's works and sewed them together into a quilt. Of course, people also do the usual essays, but part of what they're recognizing is that Morrison is calling on both our left and our right sides of the brain. And the world has recognized that, as you see in these extraordinary pictures of honorary degrees and commemorations by the governments of Italy or France, by numbers of universities here and elsewhere. And most recently, you probably know she's going to give the commencement address at Rutgers. Here, standing in the Madison Room of the Library of Congress, a representation that Morrison is a writer for the world, and that she's changed all of us, but not merely by asking us to look at the history. I think it's the way she has asked us to approach it. She says she's not interested in anger, but in opening up spaces of articulation, understanding. These wonderful pictures from the Dance Theater of Harlem, making a way out of no way and creating art with bodies that are in fact extraordinarily beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Linda Susan. I want to open it up now to those of you who have been listening to the presentation to ask your questions, and also to remind you, Linda Susan, about the way you'll be reading those questions.
Okay.
They're in a little pane there that you can open up.
Oh, I see. There are questions.
Yeah.
Yes, yes, yes. Okay, okay. Does the contemplative practice of reading, teaching, being, ever have a place for anger? I think here, in the wake of your presentation, of Adrienne Rich's call for a revisioning our histories as women, or of Langston Hughes's anger in his early work. Is there a relationship between anger and opening up spaces of articulation, or are these mutually exclusive experiences? And then it goes on to say, this is a comment, but I actually do think that this is a very good question. I don't think that there's a set of poles and the contemplative is on one end and anger is on the other. And one of the reasons I wanted to start with the clip is because I don't think it is possible to suggest a kind of quiet mindfulness that does not take into account the injustice and the turmoil that one feels in looking at such violation. Morrison does address this question, it seems to me, when she talks about her character Guitar in a group called the 7 Days. One of the things that they decide to do in order to bring justice to the world is every time there is the death of a black person, they will kill a white person. And this will somehow create a sort of balance. But one also sees what this particular approach does to Mr. Smith, who opens the novel by committing suicide, to a man named Porter, who says that that kind of love is too heavy to carry, or Guitar himself. I think if one looks at something like Playing in the Dark, there's no question but that there is a very strong critique of the ways in which African Americans have, on one hand, appeared to be invisible in American culture, and yet, as Morrison points out, the American literary and historical imagination is inconceivable without us. So I don't think it's that there's a problem with anger. I think the question is anger the destination or part of the itinerary? There's another question that says, how can we use Lectio to move beyond the anger that we may feel looking at those images in the Strange Fruit video? One of the things that I do when I look at those images, and I have to confess, I can't do that very often. It's excruciatingly painful and very difficult. I try to see everything that's in the frame. And what I mean by that is I try to see each face, especially in that awful frame where you can see a man who's being burnt alive after having gone through the removal of his phallus, which people are treating as if they are at some sort of barbecue. I try to ask myself, what are what are the people who are perpetrating this? What are they experiencing, especially when they look into the camera and smile, or have children or other family members looking into the camera and smile, when they sit with their hands locked against their chests as if they have accomplished an important and necessary task. And the questions that come to me when I do that, and I think this is part of what sort of the contemplative vantage does, I'm not just asking about anger, not that that's not important. I'm asking myself, what are the people in this photograph afraid of? What is the source of their fear? And do they feel they have quenched it? So that in part I work at not dehumanizing anyone in the picture, because if I do, then I don't really disagree with the people who are committing the atrocity. I may simply be disagreeing with who should be at the center of attention. What I'm really trying to do is to maintain the humanity of everyone in that picture, and then see where my contemplative experience takes me. So part of it is, what do I see that one doesn't see simply looking at the surface? What do I hear? What do I taste? What do I smell? What do I come to understand? Wonderful question. What is Toni Morrison's idea of paradise? I think she certainly plays with it in Tar Baby, giving us this island paradise that turns out to be anything but that. She has a wonderful quote someplace where she says, paradises are such because they're about who gets locked out rather than who gets locked in. So talking about paradise is really about those who've been expelled from paradise. And in the novel Paradise, where you have an African-American community that's come through the rigors of what we see in Reconstruction and afterwards, and they decide to set up a town that will be perfect, except, of course, that they themselves have fallen into the trap of not paying attention to history, and in sort of locking themselves in the position of being the oppressed, don't recognize the ways in which they take on the roles of the oppressor. And so when you have a group of very interesting women who live down the road and who fly in the face of what the good men, for the most part, of Ruby think is the way for upward mobility, etc., the way to come to terms with the legacy of oppression, then we are in a world that is, in fact, murderous. I don't want to say much more than that if people haven't read the novel. I think the notion that any place, whether it's a definition, is a fixed location, I think that is exactly what Morrison is working against in so much of her work. That she's leaving room, because nothing can be as claustrophobic as definition or notions of perfection.
Thank you so much, Linda Susan. She really has so many things to teach us, and you've managed to entice us to know even more. And I know that there will be many conversations to follow up on this and penetrate her work. Have you ever had a chance to meet Toni Morrison?
Not personally, but I remember being in the audience, I think in 1983, when she read from a novel she was working on called Beloved.
Oh, okay.
And when she did that, you could, I mean, I think there were, well, literally there were hundreds and hundreds of people in the room, and people were spellbound.
Yeah, no, she brings something really astounding. And thank you so much for bringing what you offered us today, Linda Susan, with all the twists and turns. And to everyone who attended. Before we sign off, I do want to invite you to participate in our next webinar, which will be on May 23rd at 3 p.m. And we have David Zlotnick, who's professor of law at Roger Williams University School of Law, and he's been integrating mindfulness theory and practice to his courses, including courses with students preparing for their trial advocacy. So we'll have registration available up on the website very soon and send you all an email inviting you to join us. And for now, farewell until we meet again. And thanks so much, Linda Susan.
Thank you very much, and thanks to all who came.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.